Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I see people coming in, but let me just begin this quick introduction. My name is Ganit Ankori. I'm the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum. And on behalf of the Rose team and our partners, Beyond Conflict, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our program. Tonight's conversation, generously supported by the Wolf Kahn Foundation, is presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Peter Sachs' Resistance. The show is on view through December 30th, and it presents about 88 portraits of resistors from across the globe, immersed in a soundscape, an audio collage comprised of their words read out loud by towering contemporary figures. We hope that you will have a chance to visit the museum and experience this very moving and important installation. Tonight's program is related to aspects of the show. We will be discussing recent examples of displacement, uprootings, the loss of home and homeland experienced by individuals and communities. Using distinct but also overlapping prisms, art, science, social activism, etc. Our guests will reflect upon the trauma of displacement, but also consider methods of building resilience, achieving renewal, and reimagining home and hope. Thanks to our brilliant guests, author and scientist Mike Niconchuk, sorry about that, Armenian-Syrian artist Kevork Mourad, and clinical psychologist Dr. Vivian Khedari DePierro. The program will be moderated by the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict, who is also a friend and a Rose board member, Tim Phillips. So, Tim, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Ganit. It's a real pleasure to be doing this with the Rose Art Museum. And thank you for that very sort of kind introduction. And I want to thank Chad and the other colleagues at the Rose for helping facilitate this. And the other thing I want to do is pay homage to the work of Peter Sachs, which, as Ganit mentioned, is on display at the Rose Art Museum. And Portraits of Resistance is one of the most powerful art exhibitions I've seen in a long time. And so as the Rose, which is actually celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, happens to coincide with Beyond Conflict celebrating its 30th anniversary. And so this is a great opportunity for both organizations to find a way to sort of collaborate, as we've done in the past, on issues that really sort of touch upon us, that intersection of not just art, science, and practice, but as you'll hear in this conversation, in each of those is an endeavor to figure out how do we make meaning of our lives. And particularly in places of violence, conflict, trauma, resilience, loss, displacement, which the world is seeing way too much of. And I will say just briefly about Beyond Conflict, for those of you who don't know us, over these last 30 years, we have centered our approach, what I call human-centered shared experience, meaning that we would bring together in many countries around the world, individuals who never imagined change in their own setting, who never imagined they could sit across the table from their enemy, or imagine living in a different society. And so the pathway in our work was not at that time science or negotiation or dialogue strategies, but the power of this shared experience, believing that people can learn from the experience of others. And when I think back over the last 30 years, one of the most powerful motivators is to recognize that others have struggled the same way. And the belief that if they could do that, why can't we do this here? And, there was, speaking of resistance in many countries, resistance to believing, how can people in other countries understand my pain and suffering? How can people in other countries understand what we've been through? And by meeting people in this very sort of humble, human-centered approach, they realize, wow, they've experienced the same challenges, the same fears, the same questions of, can we forgive? What are we selling out when we sit across the table from somebody who's oppressed us or imprisoned us or killed members of our family? And unfortunately, this is part of the continuous story of the human experience. And so art at its best, as we've seen in Kevork's work, as we've seen in Peter's work and many other artists, really helps bridge the desire to find meaning in life. And what you'll hear from Kevork and then my colleague Vivian and Mike, who I'm very proud to work with and have worked with for years now, is how we bring the resources of science, brain and behavioral science, clinical psychology, and shared experience to the challenges we're facing here at home in the United States and abroad. And the serendipity and maybe the divine wonder of when you hear the stories of Kevork, Vivian, and Mike, and it's the first time that Kevork is meeting Vivian and Mike, I think this will make this a very rich conversation. So I'll turn it to Kevork. He'll present himself and tell a little bit about his story and what he's doing. Then we'll go to Vivian and then Mike, and then I'm going to begin hopefully a conversation that will flow, and then we'll go to Q&A. So thank you, and I turn it to you, Kevork.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Such an incredible and inspiring place to be. So I was born in Syria. Unfortunately, or fortunately, when you look at the paper, there are two different birthplaces. One is Kamishli and one is Aleppo. I'm just going to clarify this because some people, when they look at my kind of CV and they see two different birthplaces. So when my grandparents arrived as a refugee to Syria, they settled right away on the border, northeast part of Syria, which is it's called Kamishli. Obviously, they were so tired and they want to just feel safe, and they settled on the border. But my parents, when they needed to have access to better medical care, they went to Aleppo, and I was born in Aleppo. But because of the bureaucracy, they will never register you where you were born. You have to go back, to where your parents were born. So basically, I was born in two places at the same time, Kamishli and Aleppo. Growing up, my grandfather, as a troubadour, he really influenced my kind of artistic career. He played incredible Kurdish music. He arrived to Syria and learned Kurdish music, and he played on tambour and celebrated the Kurdish music. So I felt like with my work, I was following his footsteps. So I went to Armenia. I studied art there, printmaking, bookmaking, and painting there. But I was always fascinated by music. Music was somehow the force that drove my lines, and I feel like music kind of shaped my lines without me thinking about what I was trying to make. So I did the first experiments in Armenia, collaborating with musicians there. When I arrived to America, I tried to explore that. And early on, I met my wonderful friend and collaborator, Kinan Azme. We put together a piece called Epic of Gilgamesh, trying to protect the ancient artifacts in Iraq and figure out a way to put Syrian artists on the map. So we kind of documented what was happening during the war, and plus we added the 12 tablets of Gilgamesh in our piece. So that was kind of a way to document what we were feeling. We thought that no one knew where Syria is, so through art we can show them where it is. So when the conflict and the peaceful uprising started in Aleppo, I felt huge responsibility to somehow capture my beloved city, Aleppo. Aleppo was kind of so much and gave me such an incredible inspiration. The architecture, the colors and sounds and all that. So I decided to somehow capture in one word what I felt about how people kind of kept Aleppo as precious, as kind of survived throughout centuries. So I created this piece I called Immortal City. Happened to be my first solo exhibit in America at the Rose Art Museum. So with this piece, I was trying to capture how people throughout the centuries, they tie themselves in this amazing, elaborate, multi-layered city. Many fates existed until not too long ago. I'm not sure many Armenians left there, but I know so many Jews, they're forced to leave. So in this work, I somehow think that I captured how people protected that city and kept that city alive. And then the next slide, which I wanted to somehow think about throughout centuries, how Syria and between Aleppo and Damascus, those two cities, they've seen so many incredible things. So I try to capture the layers, the time layers of that part of the world. So here, this on the left side is this cutouts, 3 layers. Each layer represent a slice of time. In the back, we have the Syrian citadel. On the right is the Palmyra Gate, and we see this incredible elaborate tapestry. So the reason I created, and I'm still creating, so when my ancestors arrived to Aleppo, they brought with them only their stories, their culture, and their songs. And when I first time heard from my grandmother about how her mother came to Syria and how she lost her 2 boys and her husband. So imagine this young mother, she hears this chaos outside. She runs out of her home in historic Armenia, in Urfa, in Turkey today. She goes out and she sees a chaos, and she goes to the bakery where her husband was working, and she can't find her husband because it's all burning and destroyed, and she can't find her 2 boys. And her neighbors, they convince her to escape because otherwise she was going to perish too. So they arrive, and with so many days of walking, to Syria. And then the next thing, we see that she's being adopted by this a Muslim family, and they're all kind of, the family is waiting for this young woman to convert to Islam. And she was delaying until she heard a couple months later, a group of Armenians are going to Aleppo. She goes and she joins them. She arrives to Aleppo a day and a half later walking, and she goes to the bakery to beg a piece of bread, and she says, "Can I have a piece of bread?" But meanwhile, when she looks up to the baker's face, she realized that's her husband. He also somehow survived and arrived to Aleppo, and there they had their 2 daughters. One is my grandmother who told me those stories. And I felt that the only way I can share all this to the world is through this work. So the layers of incredible stories and kind of songs and tapestries that they created out of nothing in this new land. And now, for the second time, 10 years ago, many Armenians and many Syrians, they were forced to leave their homes. And I wanted to help them. I wanted to share their stories through my work. And I created Home Within performance with Kenan Azmeh. We kind of went to a couple of refugee camps, Zatari. We did a little performance there. And then later on, I went to Al Azraq, did a little workshop with the kids. And that was such an incredible experience. And so until now, until what you see this slide, I was working on paper. And as you know, working on paper, you have to save it. It's like rolled and it takes big space and you can't travel with it. And thinking about how my grandfather's troubadour, he carried his instrument with him, I said, you know what, I have to find a way to create something like that. You can travel and almost like you're carrying your tent and pitch it this large piece. And so the next piece, which is I think the 5th slide, is actually the first piece that I created on fabric. This was done in Armenia. I arrived to Armenia and they said, tell us what you want to create. And I started thinking about, again, the land and the history of Armenians and what happened to them in the historic Armenia. And I said, you know, I want to rebuild the lost city. So this is homage to an incredible medieval city called Ani. If anyone Googles Ani city, you might find one ruined monastery. This in the Middle Ages used to be one of the most incredible, elaborate cities, had 1,100 churches. So I decided to rebuild this, and happened to be on fabric. I'll continue more later on. I don't want to take much time from the other panelists, but I think I'll keep some more information for later.
Well, thank you, Kevork. I mean, this work I've seen in person is so powerful, and these photos, like right now, are powerful, but they don't do justice to the layering, the sculptural quality of what you've created in this work. And I know when I saw it at the Rose Art Museum a few years ago, I came to see you in New York. It was so touching, and what you've tried to do. And when you say about your grandmother or great grandmother fleeing Armenia, it was after a genocide, and then walking to Syria, and finding a place to really find safety over time, right? But that history, that trauma, that desire to live and to have a family is so central to their experience, but I think to the human experiences, I think Vivian and Mike will also talk about. And yet the really the sadness of fleeing Armenia to Syria, and then in your generation having to flee Syria and trying to reconstitute life elsewhere, is an unfortunate part of the human experience. But it's this resilience and resistance to that keep on happening and repeating, and how do we intervene in people's lives is so key. So with that, I want to turn, thank you, we'll come back to you, Vivian, next. And if you could talk a bit about you and the work, and also a bit of the serendipity that you shared yesterday about your family's journey, both in Syria and Armenia, and where you had lived recently, into your experience.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my dog picked that moment to start barking, so had to mute for a moment there. This is a wonderful presentation to hear, and it's beautiful to witness not just the art, but the story behind it. Like Tim mentioned, and preparing for this, we kind of discovered this coincidence of that I also happen to have Armenian. My great-grandparent was Armenian, and they fled to Aleppo. And then from Aleppo, they migrated to Venezuela. And then my family had to leave Venezuela because of the situation there. So reflecting upon the material, it's interesting because it should have, for me, it highlights how it can touch upon my own story being Venezuelan, because the experience of displacement and the experience of migrating does have a lot of in common. But I got sidetracked. I was supposed to say also what I do and who I am, not just that part. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with Beyond Conflict with Tim and Mike as researcher and clinician there. And a lot of my work has focused on migration. I like to say that research is me-search. And so I was always very interested on how I could work as a clinician with, given that I have half Syrian heritage and half Venezuelan heritage, and those are the two leading groups, or were, I don't know whether Ukraine has surpassed one of them, but were the two leading groups of displaced populations. It was always a topic that hit home for me, and a topic that I wanted to focus my energy as a clinician on and as a researcher on. So it's always wonderful to see how also through different pathways, we end up kind of doing things that honor our own experience, be it through art or through clinical work too. So I'll leave it at that for introductions, Tim.
Yeah, and then maybe, thank you. We'll come back to what you're doing in El Salvador and Colombia and elsewhere. And then maybe I'll turn to you, Mike. And then one of the things, Mike, also, as you talk about your work, and if you don't mind, a bit of what, like you often said to me, research is me-search as well. And I think that's probably for all of us to some extent. But also, one of the things that struck me is how we make meaning, whether you're an artist, whether you're a clinical psychologist, or whether starting as you did, working in a humanitarian setting in the Zatari refugee camp, led you to look at what other options are possible. So I turn it to you, Mike.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kevork and Vivian. It's a pleasure to be the outlier in this Syrian-Armenian group we formed here. As Tim mentioned, I've worked at Beyond Conflict for about 6 years. I currently serve as the program director for some of our work that looks at social and psychological repair. I work closely with Vivian, of course, on issues of migration and of policy and practice responses to assist with communities' journey in repair, both social and psychological, after conflict. Of course, as with all of us, I think, that live in the United States, or most all of us, we come from stories of migration. My own family, my mother is from Guatemala, and my father is of Ukrainian and Irish ancestry, with different migration stories to the United States in the 1920s. So all of us are coming from this narrative of having some of our blood be tied to stories of displacement. And of course, I've been privileged enough to spend the past several years, the past 10 years, working mostly with folks from Syria that have been displaced by the crisis there, and exploring this idea of destruction, rebirth, and renewal, and what that looks like as folks move away from home. And as you can probably tell from Kevork's comments and his art, there's something very unique about certain non-Western cultures and how tied folks are to land, to place. And one of the biggest lessons that I learned in working with communities from Syria was that the idea of displacement is far deeper than simply the loss of things and of people. It is a loss of a lot of things that represented meaning, because it's a loss of generational ties to land, ties to the way that certain olives grew in one part of Syria versus another. These are deeply embedded narratives that might seem foreign to someone that didn't grow up in that context, but you go to a place like Syria and you know if the pomegranates are from Qamishli versus from Dar'a, because there's something different about the soil, those nuances that are tied to how folks express and feel and experience displacement years later. I had the honor last week of spending much of last week in Berlin with several young men who recently crossed through the forests of Belarus and Poland, as they were particularly scared of being drafted into the Syrian army, as many new recruits are being sent to Russia to fight in Ukraine. And as I was working with them and thinking about this panel, it reminded me acutely of how the journey of displacement is not a one-time process. And as Kevork and Vivian and their family stories can attest to, this is a lifelong process where being displaced is constantly in a battle with feeling settled. And there's almost a certain sense of guilt, I think, that comes with feeling settled once again and coming from a story of migration, because with settlement comes potential uprooting again. So there's a cyclical nature to this that I think is important to think of, and that I see represented very clearly in Kevork's work.
Thank you, Mike. And it's, what you and Vivian and Kevork have said is really powerful. And I want to begin to have a conversation, and maybe the first thing I'll frame it as is, so each of you in your lived experience and your family experience understand what displacement and migration feels like. In either in one's own immediate life or within one generation or two generations. Now, Kevork, I'd love maybe you to talk about how, and you touched upon it earlier, when you decided as an artist, this is the way to express and make meaning, not only of your lived experience, but your parents and grandparents, and how do you reconstitute, as Mike said, this place, the importance of place, the sacredness of place, and the land attached to it. And you've done it through this visual medium of art in a really powerful way. And I remember in the conversation with Vivian, it's like, how do people make meaning of their experience on a human psychological level? And that's a big part of what Vivian's been doing. So maybe Kevork, if you could just touch upon, I know you touched upon it earlier, about what was your own thought process? I mean, what were you struggling with? What meaning were you trying to make in your own life and the art that you were creating?
Yeah, so I think earlier I said about my grandparents, how they arrived to Syria as refugees after the genocide. So my grandfather came with his brother, 2 orphans, to Qamishli, and he quickly learned Kurdish, and he started playing music and sharing his artistry with Kurdish people. So that was a huge tribe. But later on, growing up, I realized my mother was not telling me any stories about the genocide. I was only hearing that from my grandmother. And not too long ago, I noticed that so many of my friends, Armenian friends here and there, they told me similar things. I feel like there was this trauma that I feel like my mom completely erased, my mom's generation completely erased and stopped sharing anything related to what happened to her grandparents. So not only that, and I also noticed from my father's side and my mother's side, there were a kind of mental kind of issues. One of my uncles from my father's side, one of my two of my aunties. But I thought, this thing, I cannot share it with many people because this is my family kind of secret. But again, I heard that so many of Armenians whose grandparents went through this similar journey to genocide, they had similar issues. So the trauma actually kind of jumped a generation, and later on, my generation is the ones actually trying to use it as a tool to share it with the world. So in my work, I started creating work about my ancestors, which is very specific about Armenians, how they arrived after the genocide, and try to build something in a completely different culture, in an completely Arabic culture, and a different language and different religion. And somehow they created this incredible, very pure voice. And I put that in my work. But I said, I cannot isolate that from the Syrian people. Early on, I started getting influenced by the Arabic calligraphy and the facade of all the buildings and all that. So I incorporate that in my work. But then the layers of the stories that I heard from my grandmother, and in witnessing how my uncles and aunties were kind of depressed, I had to put them in these layers of work. So my layers refers to time and the tragedies and elaborate stories to create a tapestry of the region. But slowly, I wanted to share this with the world, saying that this is a humanity crisis, not only Syrian-Armenian crisis. That's why if you want to show, for example, the Tower of Babel, which is the last one, I said, you know what? Yes, I'm going to take the next slide, please. I said, I'm going to take the Armenian and the Arabic and the Hebrew and Kurdish and all that languages. I'm going to embed it inside. So this is Tower of Babel. It's everyone knows about this story about Old Testament, where all the languages sprung out of here. So behind every window, every door, there's a writing that each person, regardless where they come from, when they're in front of this piece, they're going to hear their ancestor's story. So I think it's important somehow to relate ourselves, doesn't matter where we come from, with the world story, with kind of humanity, period.
Thank you, Kevork. I mean, this work is extraordinary, and I love what you said about each window allows somebody to hear their ancestor's story. And I'm going to turn to Vivian, and I think of what Vivian has said to me in the past about people have this real, certainly psychological, almost sort of biological need to feel heard and understood. And maybe Vivian, if you could talk about some of the work you're doing in Central America, but also how it ties to the need to make meaning, and what does that actually look like from your sort of clinical point of view, as well as your own lived experience.
Sure. I think I'll start with the clinical part, as it is where the most straightforward connection comes to mind, just listening to you speak, Kevork. And it's really, for me, I think I just want to first respond to what I heard you comment, because something that I find fascinating in what you share about the art is how if we go back to this idea of the Tower of Babel and how we will all understand something differently witnessing the art, I think it is true, and it's particularly special how the art reconstructs these places, but it reconstructs these places with these layers that you're talking about, the layers that includes the family memories and the stories that were passed on and all these other symbolic elements. And so when we go back to this idea of the home within that you were talking about with your art, something that was just very salient for me is, again, this idea that I witness frequently when working and speaking with migrants that were forced to leave and think about the idea or fantasize with the idea of returning, and sort of hitting upon this wall where they realize that there really is no return to what they left, that what they wish they could return to is really like a moment, because it's not just a space, but it's like the combination of all of these elements that you were mentioning. It was the people who were there and the interactions that they had with you, and like all of the symbols and elements that created that place and made that place the home that it was. And so in a way, this idea, like when I hear you speak about your art and how you're kind of tapping into all of the stories of your family, when you're like building it and layering it, I think about that that's kind of what we all do a little bit. We all kind of hold on to these ideas of home that are just like the art, a little bit static. They are not evolving, but the places that we left are. And so that's what kind of leads to this, like the home that you kept static in art with the memories, but that you're no longer part of. And now if you did go back, you wouldn't necessarily find in the same way. And so really the only way to keep it alive is through, in your case, the meaning making that you find in the art that maintains the story. So the story that was passed on by your grandmother, but then you find a way to express it in the art, like you find a way to make it more permanent and not just exist within you. I think that that's kind of when I speak with Tim about meaning making, I think that that's a lot of what I see and what I have personally experienced as well. But it's like this idea that we kind of try to find the medium for which we can really put a word or express and feel validated by of the experiences that we're carrying, because it can be quite isolating to carry that idea of like not belonging. And so I think that some people find it in literature, in poems, in art, in the work that they do. For me, I find it in like finding other people do their own meaning making, like witnessing the meaning making that my own clients do in sessions with me. So I think a lot about that, hearing you. And I kind of might have or might not have answered your question, Tim, because I was just connecting the dots there.
No, I love it, but
redirect me.
And Tim,
Yeah,
maybe if I can, because
Sure.
I mean, I Vivian and I know how each other's brains work a little bit here too. And all three of us, I think we've batted this question around amongst ourselves quite a bit. I was reading a paper the other day that was talking about how among, for example, certain violent extremist combatants, there was ironically lower levels of post-traumatic stress disorder among those who willingly joined and fought and participated in violence versus those who were forced recruited into that group. And I think a lot of this comes back to the idea of what is disruptive to a person's understanding of self. And this is what makes trauma so, frankly, traumatic, is when people don't have a way of making sense of the experience that happened. For an individual who might have done something that you or I deem as grotesque or gruesome or traumatic to our sense of our ethical code and our moral framework, for you or I, that thing might have been a form of moral injury if we were forced to participate in it. Whereas for someone who their very ideology and sense of role and place in the world is tied to the perpetration of violence, it's not so much the act itself as how that act sits alongside how we've made meaning of ourselves and how we understand our role in the world. And the recovery process for folks, individuals and communities after going through collective or individual traumatic experiences largely rests on the ability and way that we can reconstruct the experience that we've been through to derive a sense of meaning from it. Here we go back to Viktor Frankl, Austrian psychotherapist who documented his own journey of suffering in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. That line between, what is, he said that hopelessness is suffering devoid of meaning. But when suffering exists alongside meaning, it becomes what we call sacrifice. And sacrifice is something that we can more willingly engage in than trauma that is forced upon us. So the role of meaning plays a critical role in how we define the things that happen to us and how we respond to them, either in the moment or even much farther down the line across generations.
Thank you. And can I ask both you and Vivian, when you, Mike, have been working in Zatri, refugee camp just over the border from Syria with our Syrian friends and colleagues for the last few years, or with Syrians or Afghanis who have been displaced in Europe or elsewhere in the Middle East or here or in Latin America, as you know, or Vivian in the work you're particularly doing in El Salvador and Colombia, how, Kevork is one powerful example of how somebody has used art as a way to make meaning and sort of place himself in the world with everything that he and his family have experienced. What do you say to the people you work with, starting with you, Vivian, about how you help them make meaning if they don't have access to the tools or the training that Kevork may have as an artist?
Yeah, I think that the meaning making can be like an extremely individual process. I do think that some of what we have tried to do at Beyond Conflict is provide psychoeducation to people and kind of explaining from a more like biological lens how our body and our brain is shifting with the stress, and particularly when we started this work with the stress of forced displacement and war with Syrian refugees, and like thinking about how we can teach people in accessible ways what science has to say about their experience. And I think that that can be, for many people, something that they can incorporate into their meaning making in two ways. Like one way is that it's something that could make them reconsider conclusions they had drawn about themselves. So some people can draw conclusions from the events that they have had to endure that are quite negative about themselves. Like if everything bad happened to me and I'm the common denominator, perhaps it's a flaw in me that it's making me always have to experience this, or perhaps there's like a curse in my family that we're always having to be displaced, and just like this like very negative views of the world that take a lot of agency away from people. And so being able to hear an explanation that is science-based, that might offer an alternative way of looking at things, is something that might lead some people to reconsider the conclusions they had drawn about their experiences. So that's one way. And then a second way is also, very closely tied, is that they actually do incorporate the science itself into the meaning making. So not just like as a way of checking themselves and like reconsidering their narrative, but also just thinking about how science highlights the resilience that they might have, how like, well, this my story is the story of like somebody who has survived and endured because my brain was wired this way. Like they can like actually incorporate it into their personal narrative. And like you said, as like I find meaning in understanding that my brain adapted in certain ways after the trauma, and that even some validation of like this lived experience and this distress that I feel, it is embodied in me. Like they have shown me how my brain has changed because of this experience. It's not just like an idea that exists that way. Like I have experienced that my brain has changed, and it will continue to do so as I get to safety, as I draw new conclusions. But sometimes people also like can draw a lot of comfort in knowing that what they feel has like a valid and concrete proof that this happened. It's like, where is the scar of this pain that I have? And being able to say like, oh, there is, it's in there somewhere, but it isn't a permanent injury. I will recover, but that it isn't also something that will be erased. And so people really fear their experiences being erased. So I think through psychoeducation, we kind of give people more elements that they can incorporate as they would to how they're organizing their experience. And once they find something that clicks, that's when people experience a sense of relief, a sense of calm. Until they do that, it's kind of that idea of like the shattered expectations of the world after trauma. Like it doesn't make sense. We cannot organize it because we really like the language or the narrative that might make all of these events come together in a way that makes my world predictable and safe. So I think that that's where I see the work that Beyond Conflict has been doing psychoeducation with displaced people and trauma-affected populations as really tapping into people's abilities to draw meaning.
Thank you, Vivian. And Kevork, you said earlier about your grandmother was very difficult for her to tell the stories of what happened, and for your and the difficulty within your family. And what I would not just assume, what I've seen in my own immigrant grandparents' background, there's a sense of shame that it must be something about us. It must be something about our experience, right? We did something wrong, either the family, the community, or the quote unquote group we come from. And I think what was powerful about Vivian was saying relates to one of the things that Mike had done in Zatri and elsewhere, is recognize that there was something profoundly missing in the way the refugee humanitarian world were dealing with people who were suffering through these profound experiences. And I don't use the word trauma, because one of the things I learned from Vivian and Mike is trauma can be misused. And so, you know, people have been through really profoundly difficult experiences. But one of the most important things I found in the work that Mike and Vivian did is to learn that what is happening to you is not unique to you as an individual or a family. Other humans, if they've been through the same experience, would feel the same way, is actually liberating, right? It's empowering. It's like, okay, well, there's something about feeling that and understanding that. And the next step is, where does that actually happen in the brain? Strips away a sense that there's something you should be ashamed of because of who you are or your family, right? This is part of the human experience. And we can show you in the brain how others would to some extent respond the same way. And Mike, if you could maybe just talk about and build off what Vivian was saying, and also Kevork's family experience about what is it about, I mean, the other thing is, one of the things that we try to do in our work and what you're doing, Kevork, is not just the individual expression of renewal and reimagining, but how the work needs to be done writ large, whether it's in mental health for displaced populations, whether it's in humanitarian work, you know, challenging the paradigms that exist. Mike?
Yeah, Tim. I mean, I shared with you a long time ago. I've worked in Zatari refugee camp since the first day that it opened in July of 2012, and have watched it evolve ever since. And it baffles me to a certain extent when new employees and NGOs come to Zatari refugee camp now and talk about the trauma of the war in Syria with children. These children were mostly born in Zatari refugee camp at this point, but there's such an ingrained bias, a bias amongst a lot of us to assume that forced migrants, especially those who have migrated because of war, the primary thing that's causing distress, emotional distress, psychological distress, or even manifesting in different somatic or health problems is the trauma of war. But we forget that the system itself is incredibly stressful and creating all sorts of really structural adversities for folks. When I hear dictatorships talk about resilience, I shudder a little bit, Tim, because resilience is a really cool term to be able to abdicate responsibility for turning a blind eye to structural inequalities and injustices that perpetuate folks' trauma. There was a really fascinating study done recently following teenage migrants who were from Syria, but had first migrated to a country in the border of Syria and then took the onward journey to Europe. And it documented very clearly that the most difficult experiences, the experiences that were leading or contributing the most to adjustment difficulties and post-traumatic stress disorder and related symptoms, were among those individuals who had more stressors or more stressful experiences post-initial migration, or in fact in their integration in Europe. So we overlook we think that going through war is the experience we have to focus on for communities, or being displaced because of economic turmoil and political turmoil in a place like Venezuela or El Salvador. But the reality is the lived experience of the migrant is in and of itself traumatic, because we don't know how to receive folks, and folks deal with discrimination day in and day out. And so whether it's through art or whether it's through psychoeducation, as Vivian was mentioning, fundamentally, this is a process of, I don't know a lot of folks who have tremendous power who don't have core ingredients of pain. So it's, how do you alchemize people's pain to turn it into power? And that can be done through the process of art, through the process of psychotherapy, or through the process of broader education initiatives. And I'd be curious to hear what Kevork has to say about some of this too, because he's closer to this on some levels than I am.
It's, you know, what's fascinating, Mike, what you're describing is so true. And not too long ago, I came across this fascinating article about how the refugees, when they arrived to Europe, they fell into sleep coma and they're not waking up. They don't know. The scientists, they were puzzled. They didn't know what happening to them, and they're falling into sleep. And I created a piece with a composer, Paola Pristini here. Actually, I showed last week that piece called Glass Box, kind of sharing this story with American audience. And I didn't know about it. I didn't know that the refugees actually, when they arrived to a safer place, they would experience something like this. On the contrary, in my mind, logically, I was saying, okay, now it's safe. I can sleep and wake up healthy and continue my life. No, the opposite. So you're absolutely right. It's not only what happens at the camp or what happens in their homeland, but it's continuously happening, and they're witnessing this incredible things that the world needs to know, so we can figure out how to kind of share their stories so other people can heal them and help them.
Thank you. Kevork, in your experience, I remember you saying once that in Zatri, when you try to get particularly the young people there to maybe engage in art.
Yes.
Talk about that. There was some resistance, I guess, right?
Yes. So I went there twice, as I said. The first time with Kinan, and second time with Woman, the incredible virtuoso pipa player. We arrived and we went to the urban camp, which was kind of, I think, this term where from the refugee camp, they go into the city, and from there on, they will find a home for them. So when we were there, trying to do some workshop, music and art, and I asked the teenagers, okay, let's figure out a way to tell story through these tools. I was showing them to do monotype and using a different way of expressing their stories. And I'm speaking with them in Arabic, and I'm saying, please just start. Someone has to start. Someone just tell me something. And they were all dead silence. No one was saying anything, not sharing anything. I'm like, what's happening? There were around 20, 25 kids. And as soon as two kids started drawing with giggling and laughing, others started doing similarly kind of jokingly drawings. And when I saw the work, I was shocked. They were creating such a dark and gruesome drawings. So imagine those two kids, probably they were 9 or 10-year-olds. They're drawing themselves playing soccer, but the soccer ball was beheaded head with bloods. And the next kid was drawing this a figure was being flattened by the tank. And I'm like, I have kids. When I go home, how I'm going to share those stories with them? And can you compare these two different environments with each other? So it's kind of unbelievable situation. Of course, it was incredibly heavy, but it's also inspiring. I also remember when they were leaving, this one kid with his sketchbook stayed there, is looking at me. And I said, do you need any help? Do you have any questions? He said, when I grow up, I want to be like you. I want to go tell my story to the world. And I had goosebumps. I said, I remember when I was at boy's age, I wanted to figure out a way to tell my story to the world and to tell the human story, to tell the story that symbolizes all of us together. So that boy was somehow, it was kind of a hope. It was kind of the spark to see that these kids, they're going to go somewhere, hopefully. They're not going to stay there forever.
Wow, thank you. Can I ask all three of you, what's the best way to convey to people who don't have this direct lived experience or working with displaced populations about this reality? Because one of the core things in this conversation and many others we've all had is this is part of the shared experience of humankind. In some cases, a few generations back, and unfortunately for a lot of people today. And yet, people compartmentalize their lives in certain ways that's something they don't know or they can't think about or that's too distant or too abstract. how do we make that real to people, not in a way where they feel burdened, like, I don't know what we can do about it, but in a way that people can access it, to think, okay, what are the policies we do? Who do I give my money to? Who do I support? How do I respond to elected officials or others who push and drive narratives that are very dehumanizing? And I don't know if anybody, so I'm not saying this in any political way, I'm saying, but how do we get people who don't have direct access in this work to recognize the importance of it and connect it in a very human way and in a way that people understand it? And I think, Vivian, I remember you were saying yesterday about, in a sense, the context, right? When people contextualize, like, I know what it's like in my family's lived experience.
Funnily enough, I would say that it would be through art, right? Because particularly with like people will listen to what they have an interest in listening to. So if it's about the personal testimony of people who have had these experiences, usually the people who are there to witness it or listen to it are people who already share like an affinity towards, like, either because of their own past or because of just being very much aware of the issues, just working with these populations. So really the only way that one would reach audiences that are just more, perhaps, for lack of a better word, like indifferent or out of touch with this reality, is really gonna be through art and literature, and like a character in a novel that they read, or a character in a movie that they saw, or this piece of art of an artist that made me think of it, because that's what they were most likely be engaging in and randomly run into these stories. So in a way, the avenue that Kevork has chosen is the one with the most potential here, because in terms of like me as a clinician and like somebody providing psychoeducation, the people who are going to come and listen to me already have the interest. But art is provocative in the way that it can really make somebody who was not thinking about even like considering these issues kind of like have to grapple with them, right? And so I think that that's probably like the most direct path to it. But I also think that it's an ongoing process. I mean, I think that I know a fair share about displacement because of my own story. And I remember being like quite taken aback and shocked and surprised at my own biases the first time I heard somebody, a mother, tell me about like her experience of sending her child with a coyote across the desert, and having that moment of like thinking like, are they gonna make it? This is the last time I see my child. It's like telling me the play-by-play of like what that journey across the desert to get to the US was. And I was like, I had no idea. And I have been working on this for a while, and I have been thinking about this for a while, and I continue to be shocked by people's ability to overcome incredible odds, and to like really show that if they are undertaking these journeys, is because what's behind is really quite much more terrifying, and which I think often gets forgotten when people think also about migrants and think about the migrants as a burden, rather than as somebody who has taken on the challenge of seeking something better for their families and their children, instead of giving up in a way. Not that everybody who stayed gave up, just for the record, but that they are showing incredible strength, and they are carrying with them incredible stories of overcoming. And I'm continue to be surprised by more and more stories. So I think that it's not just about reaching the unaware, that even those of us who are aware always can use a little reminder of that too.
That's really powerful. And thank you, Vivian. And Mike, I see you wanted to.
I was just gonna, I'm trying to think of what is a universal experience that people can relate to, that we could make a clear comparison to the life of most forced migrants. If anyone, I always tell people, if ever you have had to call your internet service provider over the phone because your router is broken, that is essentially the life experience of a forced migrant, because someone is always trying to tell you that you did this thing already, but no, you have to do it a different way. Just try turning it off and on. Are you sure that the cables are in? Most forced migrants know how to do everything right, and they keep trying to do it the right way, but the entire system and world is telling them that they did it the wrong way, that they have to try it again. and that the obvious solutions that they obviously have tried 6,000 times are the ones they need to do again. And it is a very frustrating experience that all of us can relate to, that makes you feel dehumanized, that makes you feel like someone on the other end of the line thinks that you're stupid and that you're never going to find the solution that you need. So I've watched a lot of young refugees from Syria go through this experience where much of their life is like being on the receiving end of a call when your router's broken and you're trying to fix your Wi-Fi. Because these are capable people that know how to do it. And they're just trying to find the ways through a system that puts all sorts of blockages there.
Thank you, Mike. And I want to go, as we come to the bewitching hour, as they say, to one question, Kevork, that came in, and that is a question which I think you touched upon, but I just want to respect this question. How do you incorporate the individual stories you collect from people, either in the community or in your art workshops, into the art you produce?
So when I first heard about refugee crisis and they asked me if I could contribute in any ways, I remembered how my friends from Aleppo, they called me, and my auntie was called me from Aleppo saying the situation is so dire, we need to escape and all this. So I felt that if I'm going to create anything, it's going to be about their voices. So I made Home Within and went to, the first stop was Germany. I decided to live drawing their voices. So when I'm drawing, basically their story was kind of sprung in the projection and all this, without even knowing that that Home Within piece, it's going to survive. It's going to become a standalone performance. So basically all of my drawings were donated. And earlier when you ask how to kind of share their story, I don't think art alone can do it. It has to be kind of with an organization who can do the other side of it. So I'm alone. If I'm in my studio creating, it's not going to happen unless this group of people in Germany asked me to create, asked me to be there. They organized everything beautifully. They collected the fund. They donated the money to the refugee camp in Lebanon and all that. So I feel like a group effort is the only way to go. So yeah, I put the individual stories into Home Within. I tried to capture what was going on in Syria, plus what was going on in kind of the world. Like I start, as I said, Syria, Aleppo, and the Armenian churches and the synagogues and the mosques. And later on, I wanted to be about the human suffrage. So I think in Home Within, I basically touched upon that. And that's the reason I'm here in this room, because Ganit saw the piece and invited me to have a conversation about that project.
Thank you, Kevork. This has been an extraordinary conversation, and I knew that bringing together a brilliant artist like you, Kevork, Mike, and Vivian, and all the great work you're doing, would find these connections. And as soon as we talk about, in the conversation yesterday to prepare for this, about really it's about making meaning in the world, and that's really one of the fundamental, sort of ways we engage ourselves and with those around us. And so it's really quite powerful. And, and then I think it really ties beautifully to the collection at the Rose, but also this exhibition about resistance, because at the core of resistance is renewal, right? It's engaging, it's reimagining, it's not accepting what is there. And so I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Ganit, Chad, and the great folks at Brandeis. And I want to thank everybody for joining us at 8 o'clock on what is a cold night here in the Boston area. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.